The nature of God, an introduction to the idea of God. I use the term in its broadest possible sense. Our ideas about what or who God is differ from one person to the next. If a person has been brought up with the idea of God and the angels being on the tops of clouds playing harps all day long, then another person, having flown in an aircraft above the clouds, is quite entitled to say that he could see neither God nor angels, and therefore they do not exist. If that person was introduced to some of the other ideas of what God could possibly be, then he may eventually be able to say that he too believes in God, albeit a different view of God from the first person. The following are just a few suggestions which may help to convince you too. Little squares and little cubes. Forget about religion, think mathematics. Measure 10 equal spaces along the bottom of a piece of paper and 10 equal spaces up the side. Now draw straight lines from these points, horizontal and vertical, x and y axes. The result will be a pattern of 100 squares, 10 wide by 10 high. Next, number the squares along the bottom, horizontal, and up the side, vertical. You will see from this that every square can be defined by two numbers, or its coordinates, such as 2, 4, this being the third square from the left-hand edge, and the fifth square from the bottom. The apparent inconsistency here is that I have numbered the coordinates rather than the squares. The first square at the bottom left-hand corner having a coordinate of 0, 0 rather than 1, 1. For practical purposes, this is a better system since it allows the squares to be subdivided into tenths or hundredths for greater accuracy. The coordinates then could be said 5.65, 8.46, giving a position to within 100th of a square. This does not matter either way as far as this work is concerned. Now any of the squares can be shaded in with a pen to produce a pattern or simple drawing of an object such as a table or a chair. Don't bother doing this, but if this pattern of squares now has very small squares and a large number, then this is basically how a computer screen, digital television or digital photography works, the squares being the pixels. The object on the screen can be defined as a long series of numbers, binary in the case of computers, which when transmitted to a blank screen can, with the marvels of electronics, produce a copy of the original just from the numbers. It gets a little more complicated with a colour image, but the point is that any object can be produced on the screen when the right series of numbers is fed into the machine. The next phase of this mental exercise is to add a third dimension, the z-axis, which gives the object depth. Instead of very small squares, we now have very small cubes. The drawing of the chair can now be seen from a position we would see it in real life, because we live in a three-dimensional world. Vastly increase the number of these tiny cubes and we can cover the whole earth, every bit of the earth having its own very large equivalent number to represent its position. In a limited sense, this has already been done. The surface of the earth is divided up on a globe or map by lines of latitude or longitude, every place being measured by degrees from the equator and a line running through Greenwich. Now I am sure most of you will have spotted the problem in relating this to the real world. In reality, the world is not made of little cubes. If it did, everything would look as though it had been built with Lego bricks, and it doesn't. The problem is that we have not as yet found what the smallest possible measurement of distance is, and even if we do, in what direction would the cubes be aligned? In the case of the Earth, it is simple, because it rotates about an axis passing through the north and south poles. Latitude and longitude are therefore in line with or at 90 degrees to the axis. But the universe, that too would have to rotate, but rotate in relation to what? For the moment all this is just theoretical, but it can be of some use, as there is a precedent in the way navigation was done at sea in the days before we had satellites. The lines of latitude and longitude are not marked on the sea, of course. They are just imaginary. But they do have a very real position, and this was determined by observation of the sun and stars, and a very accurate clock. But that's another story. So let's now introduce the philosophical and religious elements into this discussion. The idea of the universe as represented in a vast series of numbers is imaginary, that is, in the mind. But whose mind? The human mind is only capable of holding a very limited amount of data, and this amount of data is almost infinite. Where is the data bank for all this? It must be everywhere, yet nowhere in particular. Who has seen it? No one. It is invisible. So this idea of an almost infinite data bank representing the whole universe, which is invisible yet everywhere, does it remind you of anything? It is the mind of God.